So we learned a lot of concepts today, and often people tell me it's really mind-blowing. The blockchain, what is Bitcoin, the potential for it, Bitcoin in law, compliance, Bitcoin security, Bitcoin payments. It's a lot. And it's really starting to seep into our world. It's still early days. We caught up with Andreas Antonopoulos, the author of Mastering Bitcoin, and we spoke to him through a Google Hangout and asked him a lot of questions about where he thinks this is all going. How did you first hear about Bitcoin, and what did you think about it?
I first heard about Bitcoin, it was, I think, the summer of 2011. I read about Bitcoin, and my immediate reaction was, ha! Nerd money! And I completely ignored it. I dismissed it. I thought it wasn't serious. I didn't see the point. I completely dismissed it. Since I got into Bitcoin, I've discovered that this is not an uncommon reaction.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we were all born skeptics. When Satoshi Nakamoto announced Bitcoin on the crypto mailing list in 2008, he was the only one who believed in it. The second time, 6 months later, at the end of 2011, when I saw something about Bitcoin, just on a whim, I decided to read the paper, the white paper, because it was linked, I think, in the story that I was reading. And I read the white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto, and it just blew me away. I immediately recognized that this was not just a currency. More importantly, it was a network. It was a distributed system. In fact, it was a form of organization and a solution to a long-standing problem in distributed systems that enabled a completely novel trust and security model. I didn't grasp all of that immediately, but I grasped how radical and revolutionary and innovative it was. And I realized that it had so many more applications, even just in currency, but I also understood how powerful it was to have a decentralized currency, and then I got hooked, and that was it.
How do you think North American governments should regulate Bitcoin?
I think North American governments need to understand that Bitcoin is quite fundamentally different, both in terms of its architecture and in terms of the way it works, from a traditional financial and payment system. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, the question we should ask is, what is the purpose of regulation? What is the thing we're trying to achieve? Regulation just for regulation's sake, regulation just to say that we regulated it, is harmful. And it's harmful because it can limit the uses and applications of this system, primarily because of misunderstanding about how it works.
Right.
If we try to regulate Bitcoin based on our understanding of how other things that came before Bitcoin work, that would be a very bad mistake. That would be akin to the FCC in the early 90s regulating the new era of the web and regulating websites based on their understanding of, for example, scarcity of spectrum, CB radios, television stations, fixed programming, and then applying onto the nascent web a licensing requirement for operators, a list of 7 words that can't be used on the internet, programming hours for content that is suitable for children, etc., etc., and applying many of the same rules of broadcast television or radio to the internet. And that would have been absolutely destructive. It would have ruined this medium because it would have misunderstood the very nature of the internet. Right. If we do the same thing to Bitcoin and try to apply banking rules that are designed to protect consumers without understanding how consumers operate and how Bitcoin operates in a consumer environment, all we're going to do is stop Bitcoin's development in North America and limit its applicability, which in the end will not harm Bitcoin, will not stop Bitcoin, but it will push the jobs and the innovation to other countries that take a more open-minded approach and that wait until they've understood the technology better before applying regulation.
A lot of people compare the progression of the internet with the progression of Bitcoin. Where do you think we are today with the progression of Bitcoin compared to the internet?
Every new technology requires what we call in our space the killer app,
Right.
An application that demonstrates its capabilities and really shows consumers why this is a useful technology. But it's not always about the killer app. The killer app is usually just the first application that is important and significant enough to demonstrate the technology. On the internet, the killer app was email. And email made the internet something that everybody needed and something that everybody could use simply by turning publishing and text communications into a content type that could be freely and easily exchanged on a global basis across all kinds of computers. With Bitcoin, the killer app is the currency application and the payment network that's built from that, which allows people to send payments just like email.
Right.
It's email for money across the internet. But that's just the first application. The internet quickly progressed to change other forms of publishing, first with text, then with text and images, then sound, then video. And gradually we saw the multimedia experience of the web and YouTube, and eventually other forms of human expression and socialization with social networks and Web 2.0. So email really was only the tip of the iceberg. It gave us a glimpse of what was to come. With Bitcoin, the Bitcoin currency is only the tip of the iceberg. It only gives us a glimpse of what's to come. What happens when machines can communicate value amongst each other across the internet, when automated systems can exchange value, when money is programmable, when corporate structures are programmable, when entrepreneurialism is now accessible to everyone with a text-based phone. I would say that today we are where the internet was in maybe 1992. Before the invention of the web, just before the launch of the first web browser, at a time when the internet was primarily a text-based medium, and there was one killer app, it was email, and it was beginning to catch on with the mainstream. And most people had no idea what this was. Most people didn't understand why it would impact their lives. And most people made arguments very similar to the arguments we see today about Bitcoin.
Where do you see it also, how do you see it affecting the third world, the 2.5 billion that are unbanked?
I have said frequently that to me Bitcoin isn't about shopping in the first world. It's about everything else everywhere else. And to see Bitcoin as simply a slightly geekier version of the Visa network is to miss the point. The World Bank estimates that there are 2.5 billion people who are unbanked. That is a very conservative estimate and has a lot of interesting assumptions to it. The first is that they only count adult earners in a family, not the other members of the family. And more importantly, they count as unbanked anyone who has no access to banking and financial services.
Mm-hmm.
I have a broader measure which is looking at it from a different perspective. The kind of banking that I have access to, with checking and brokerage accounts that can send and receive any currency in the world from anywhere in the world and to anywhere in the world for relatively low costs with relatively few restrictions. Bank accounts that I can use to trade on international stock markets anywhere in the world, 24 hours a day, with online banking. Bank accounts which I can use to easily access deep pools of credit liquidity for personal loans or business loans. Bank accounts that I can use without government interference to trade internationally, to do imports and exports. That type of bank account is only accessible to just under 2 billion people in the world. That leaves the other 6 billion. Now, Bitcoin can enable a banking revolution across the world because it significantly lowers the cost and the technology requirements for creating mobile banking solutions by fundamentally changing the trust model. The simplest form of a Bitcoin system can be used on a simple feature phone like a Nokia 1000 text-based phone, one of the most commonly deployed phones, of which there are now almost 2 billion of these little phones all around the world, broadly deployed even in sub-Saharan Africa, where cell phone penetration is greater than that of Western Europe. And the reason for that is because the communications capabilities of these phones revolutionized communications across the African continent, across Southeast Asia, across Latin America, and the rest of the world. Now, if each one of those phones could become a banking terminal, a Western Union terminal, a Bloomberg terminal, a lending and mortgage origination terminal, and a stock market terminal for every person who has access to a basic text phone, not only does that increase the value of those existing devices, but it also gives motivation and economic incentive for many of that basic technology. Bitcoin can be deployed where no bank can be deployed today. Bitcoin can allow people to completely bypass the deployment of costly, expensive, and complex banking infrastructure and go directly to decentralized currency technology, just like they bypassed complex and expensive telecommunication infrastructure in the form of landlines and went directly to cell phone-based decentralized telecommunications. And that means that markets such as the remittance market, where more than $450 billion is sent by migrant workers to their families back home every year, that market, which currently sees average fees of 9%, including the exchange rate costs. And that's the average where many of the poorest countries have far worse percentages, in some cases exceeding 30% of the total amount being sent, being lost in fees and exchange rate conversions. Now, if you take that $75 billion or $50 billion that are being charged in fees from remittances alone, and you allow that money to be sent to the people who actually earn that money and give it to the people in the poorest countries in the world. And interestingly enough, remittances are usually received by women in developing nations who then have a far disproportionate impact on their local community, because every dollar put in their hands is invested in healthcare, sanitation, education, and community development at the grassroots level. So while the developed world is spending billions of dollars in foreign direct aid, which has to trickle down through governments and non-governmental organizations, and 90% of that never reaches the intended recipients, we have the ability with Bitcoin and decentralized finance to put money in the hands of the poorest people in the world today, using basic text messaging technology, money that they already earned, simply by cutting out the middleman, by cutting out the intermediary company that is making exorbitant profits off the misery and poverty of others. And something that we saw with the internet is that disruptive and decentralized technologies like these are very good at disintermediation, at cutting out intermediaries that cost a lot of money, charge a lot of fees, and deliver very little in terms of service, and can maintain that position because of monopoly power, because of political considerations and control. And when the internet comes along and levels the playing field, these intermediaries are wiped away clean, and people have direct access to products and services, lowering costs for everyone. Well, now with Bitcoin, we can do that for banking and cut out the fat intermediaries that have made money off the misery of others.
What do you think is the biggest challenge, the biggest threat to allowing Bitcoin to grow and, achieve its potential?
Bitcoin has many challenges at the moment, and these are all the challenges of a technology that has not yet reached maturity. Challenges of scale, challenges of ease of use, and challenges of security. At the moment, Bitcoin is complex. It's hard to understand. The applications and user interfaces are difficult for users who are not technical. Maintaining security on your own Bitcoin wallet is hard. It requires some expertise. And whereas the Bitcoin system as a whole is incredibly robust and secure, most people's personal computers are not yet ready. Now, none of this really is inherently a problem with Bitcoin. All of these things are simply the effects of a technology that has not yet matured. And to use the same analogy as before, if you look at the internet back in 1992-93, nobody knew what the hell we were talking about when we talked about
That's right.
http://www.//.at. All of that seemed mystical and weird. In order to send an email at the time, you needed Unix command line skills, and the email itself on the pre-SMTP internet network took, through the store and forward network, sometimes took 2 days to cross the internet, and sometimes didn't arrive at all.
Right.
Now, if you had asked me if my mother could use the internet as it was then, I would have been quite honest and said, nope, not a chance, not happening. And 20 years to the day after I got my first email address, my mother got her first email address on an iPad, which she could use by simply swiping her finger. And by that time, she'd heard enough of the www.at terminology to begin to understand it. So with technology, it always starts in a way that is complex and difficult to understand for the layperson. It's primarily by those who have technical expertise.
What's the most common question you get from large corporations, and how do you answer it?
The most common question really is the most obvious question, is how could we use Bitcoin to make our business better?
Okay.
And that's a question I get both from technology companies, but also increasingly from banks. Well, a classic example here, and most people don't really understand how the banking system works as a whole. It's a very opaque, complex, and obscure system, but within banking, there are many intermediaries that act as clearinghouses or settlement stations, if you like. Many banks understand that when you have a technology that can create a decentralized clearinghouse, the first thing they think about is, well, hang on, there's this little company in my backyard that's doing all of the clearing of my wire transfers, and they charge me exorbitant amounts. You're saying that they could be replaced by an algorithm? And there's this other company that does equity clearing and have opaque books, and nobody knows if the trades actually exist or not. And
Right.
there have been so many scandals, and they charge exorbitant fees, and it takes them 3 days to clear, and they often crash. You're telling me that could be replaced with a transparent, predictable algorithm where no one has control and can take advantage?
What do you think are the important things for Bitcoin enthusiasts to help spread and educate and bring more awareness to the Bitcoin world?
If you buy $20 worth of Bitcoin so that you can start playing with it and experimenting with a wallet and learning how to send and receive Bitcoin to other people, maybe buy some little thing that you wanted to buy anyway, use it to send some money across borders by electronic means to another country, donate to a charity with Bitcoin, or do some charitable work with Bitcoin, or use it to tip your friends or people you like on Twitter, which is another great application for Bitcoin. Learn how the microtransactions in Bitcoin work, how you can
That's right.
tip someone 10 cents, someone who lives on another continent, instantly over Twitter, and get to see how this technology is and learn by using it. So if you're in Bitcoin and you want to help Bitcoin succeed, educate other people on the tremendous technology that Bitcoin is. Give them some Bitcoin. Give them $2 or $3 that you can spare on the spots. Set them up with a wallet, give them some Bitcoin to their mobile phone, and show them how it works. And you'd be amazed at how many people, having used it once, will be intrigued. And suddenly they see the possibilities. So I would say demonstrate through your goodwill, demonstrate through charity, demonstrate through tipping, and talk to people about the possibility of the technology. And do not advise people to invest their life savings into Bitcoin or treat it as if it is some get-rich-quick scheme.
This was the advice you gave to Bitcoin enthusiasts. Go out and talk about it. Teach other people about it. And this is what you're doing. So thank you, Andreas. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Lauren.